If you think you know what a monster looks like, you're wrong. They don't always have claws or fangs. Sometimes they ride a big black horse and wear a long dark coat. And sometimes they come for you when you're just a little boy. The man who came for 8-year-old Henry didn't have a name. Not at first. He was just a shadow that fell over the dusty settlement, a cold silence in a world that was already too quiet. The year was 1887, Wyoming. A winter from hell had just passed, taking Henry's ma and pa with it, leaving him a ghost in a cabin full of memories. The neighbors found him, thin as a willow switch, with eyes that had seen too much darkness. They took him in, but you could see it in their faces. He was another mouth to feed in a time of starvation. He was a burden. Then the shadow rode into town. He was tall, built like an old oak tree, with a face carved from granite and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His hair was gray, his hat was black, and the gun on his hip wasn't for show. He moved without making a sound, like he was part of the wind, and when he spoke, his voice was like rocks grinding together. He walked into the general store, and the already quiet room went dead silent. The owner, a man named Peters, looked like he'd just seen a ghost. "Heard there's an orphan boy here," the stranger said. It wasn't a question. Peters swallowed hard. Young Henry, the Morrison boy, lost his folks. "I need a hand at my ranch," the stranger said, his eyes scanning the room, dismissing every man in it. "Boys old enough to work." A cold fear slithered through the store. Everyone had heard stories. Stories of men who took orphans not to help them, but to work them to the bone, to use them up and throw them away. This man, this stranger, he looked like he was straight out of one of those stories. Peters gave him the directions to the widow Henderson's place, where Henry was staying. He didn't want to, but you didn't say no to a man like this. You just prayed he'd be gone soon. Henry was outside the widow's cabin, trying to split a log with an axe twice his size when he heard the hoofbeats. He looked up and saw the man on the big black horse, and every instinct in his small body screamed, "Run." He was a predator, a wolf, and Henry was the lamb. The widow Henderson, a kind woman with a face full of wrinkles and worry, came out onto her porch. "Can I help you, sir?" "Caleb Thornfield, Winonorn," the man said, swinging down from his horse. The name sounded like a threat. "I'm here for the boy." The widow's face tightened. "Henry isn't going anywhere, Mr. Thornfield." She was brave, but her voice trembled. She was a sparrow standing up to a hawk. Thornfield didn't even look at her. His cold eyes were locked on Henry. He started walking forward, his step slow and deliberate, heavy, final. Henry dropped the axe and stumbled backward, his back hitting the rough wood of the cabin wall. There was nowhere else to go. "He looks strong enough," Thornfield said, more to himself than anyone. "He'll do." "Now you see here," the widow cried, rushing to stand between them, a fragile shield of calico and courage. "This boy has been through more than any child should. He needs kindness. He needs a family." Thornfield stopped, his gaze finally shifting to her. And what he said next froze the very air. "What he needs," he growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder, "is to learn that the world isn't kind. And he'd better learn it from me than from someone less generous." The threat was plain as day. Generous wasn't the word he meant. He meant someone who might just kill him outright. Before the widow could say another word, Thornfield's hand shot out. He grabbed Henry's arm. The grip was like a steel trap, cold and unbreakable. Henry cried out, a thin, sharp sound of pain and pure terror. The world narrowed to that crushing grip, that stone face, that terrible final feeling of being caught. "He comes with me," Thornfield declared. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact of the universe. He started dragging Henry toward the horse. The boy's feet scraped against the dirt. He twisted, he pulled, but it was like trying to fight a mountain. "Please," Henry sobbed, the tears he'd held back for months finally breaking free. "Please, I didn't do anything. Don't take me." Thornfield's grip just got tighter. He lifted Henry like he was nothing, a sack of flour, and threw him onto the saddle. "Life ain't about what you've done wrong, boy," he said, his voice flat and empty of all pity. Sometimes it's just about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The widow pleaded, she begged, she asked where he was taking the boy. Thornfield swung up behind Henry, his body a cage of leather and muscle. He didn't answer her. He just looked north, toward the jagged, unforgiving mountains that clawed at the sky. North, was all he said, and then they were gone. Henry looked back. His vision blurred with tears and saw the widow Henderson growing smaller and smaller, a tiny beacon of kindness being swallowed by a vast, cruel world. Then she was gone, and Henry was alone, utterly and completely alone with the monster. He thought it was the worst moment of his life. He had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The ride was a special kind of hell. Every jolt of the horse was a reminder of the iron grip that held him. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper of doom. Caleb Thornfield didn't speak. He just rode, his presence a heavy weight behind Henry, a constant, terrifying pressure. The sun beat down, then the shadows grew long, and then the world bled into shades of gray and black. They left the dusty plains behind, climbing into the rocky foothills, then higher, into the mountains themselves. The air grew thin and sharp, biting at Henry's exposed skin. He shivered, but not just from the cold. He was shivering with a deep, bone-rattling fear. He thought about his ma and pa. They'd told him stories about bad men in the wildlands, men who stole children. His pa had said, "You see a man like that, Henry, you run. You run and you don't look back." But there was nowhere to run. He was trapped. Night fell completely. A sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, offering no comfort, only making the jagged peaks around them look like teeth in a giant dark mouth. Henry's hope, a tiny flicker in his chest, began to die. No one was coming for him. The widow couldn't. The men in the town were too scared. He was on his own. Suddenly, Thornfield reined the horse to a stop, not in a clearing, not by a stream, but on a narrow, windswept plateau. Sheer cliffs dropped away on three sides into an abyss of shadow. The path they'd taken up was a treacherous ribbon of stone, impossible to see in the dark. It wasn't a camp. It was a trap. Thornfield dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. He reached up and pulled Henry from the saddle, setting him on the ground. The boy's legs were numb and weak. He stumbled, catching himself on a rock. He looked around, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. There was nothing here. No shelter, no fire, just wind and rock and a long, long drop. Why are we here? Henry's voice was a tiny thread of sound, almost stolen by the wind. Thornfield was unsaddling his horse, his movements calm and efficient. He didn't look at Henry. "This is where we stop for the night." "But where will we sleep?" Henry asked, looking at the bare rock. Thornfield stopped what he was doing. He turned slowly and the faint moonlight caught his face. His expression was completely blank, empty. "You're not." The words didn't make sense, and yet they made a terrible kind of sense. The air went out of Henry's lungs. He stared at the man, this monster, and a cold, horrifying understanding began to dawn. This wasn't about free labor on a ranch. This wasn't about selling him. This was about something else entirely, something final. "I don't understand," he whispered, though he was afraid he did. Thornfield took a step toward him. His shadow stretched long and menacing, swallowing Henry whole. "This is the end of the line, boy," he said, his voice as cold and hard as the stone beneath their feet. "You've got no one, no family, no value. Better to end it now, quick and clean. Better than letting you starve out there." Henry's knees buckled. He fell to the ground, the sharp rocks digging into his palms. The world tilted, spinning around him. "End it." The words echoed in his head. The man had brought him all this way, to kill him, to throw him from this cliff like a piece of trash. "No," Henry breathed, scrambling backward, away from the advancing shadow. "Please, please don't. I can work. I'll work so hard, I promise. I'll earn my keep. Just please." But Thornfield kept walking, slow, deliberate. Each footstep was a hammer blow, counting down the last seconds of Henry's life. He was a force of nature, an earthquake, a flood. You couldn't reason with it. You could only be destroyed by it. Henry's back hit a large boulder at the very edge of the cliff. He was out of room, out of time, out of hope. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw nothing but a black, hungry emptiness. Far, far below, he could just make out the silver glint of a river. It was a world away, a world he would never see again. The monster was here, and he was about to do what monsters do. He was so focused on Thornfield, he didn't hear the other sound. The soft scrape of a boot on rock, just a few yards away, hidden in the deeper shadows of the cliff face. Someone else was on the plateau. They weren't alone, and that realization was somehow even more terrifying than being alone with the monster who was about to kill him. The world had shrunk to this single, terrible moment. The cold rock at his back, the endless void behind him, and the dark figure of Caleb Thornfield blocking out the stars. Henry was trembling so hard his teeth chattered. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the hands that would grab him, the shove that would send him into the great, silent nothing. "You think being good matters out here?" Thornfield's voice cut through the wind. "You think the world gives a damn about your promises?" "My mama said," Henry started, his voice a choked whisper, clinging to the memory of her face, her gentle hands. "Your mama's dead," Thornfield snapped, the words like a slap. "And all her pretty words died with her. This is the real world, boy, and it doesn't care about you." Grief and terror twisted into a knot in Henry's stomach. He wanted to scream, to fight, but he was paralyzed. He was a rabbit in the jaws of a wolf. "They loved me," he whispered, the words a tiny rebellion. "They said I was brave." For a split second, something flickered in Thornfield's eyes. A ghost of an emotion, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then his hand shot out, grabbing the front of Henry's tattered shirt. He hauled the boy to his feet, lifting him effortlessly until his toes dangled over the edge of the cliff. The wind whipped at him, trying to pull him from that iron grip. Below him, the darkness waited patiently. "Brave?" Thornfield's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "Let's see how brave you are." Henry's hands clawed at the man's wrist, a useless, frantic gesture. His legs kicked at empty air. He could feel the sheer, terrifying drop beneath him, a physical presence pulling him down. "Please!" he gasped, tears and snot running down his face. "Please, sir, don't! I don't want to die. Please!" He was suspended there for an eternity, held between life and death by a man who seemed to be carved from hate. He looked into Thornfield's eyes, searching for a spark of mercy, a hint of doubt, anything. He found nothing but cold, hard gray. The wind howled a funeral song. Then from the shadows a new voice spoke, quiet but sharp as a razor. "That's enough, Caleb." Thornfield froze. His head snapped toward the sound. Henry, still dangling over the abyss, twisted his neck to see. A man was stepping out from behind a cluster of boulders. He was leaner than Thornfield, younger, with a grim face and watchful eyes. He held a rifle, and it was pointed directly at Thornfield's chest. "I said, that's enough," the second man repeated. "Put the boy down." Who was this man? Was he here to save him? Or was he another monster, here to join the game? Henry's mind couldn't process it. The world was coming apart at the seams. Thornfield's grip on his shirt didn't loosen. He stared at the newcomer, his expression unreadable. "You're not supposed to be here, Eli. And you're not supposed to be throwing children off cliffs," the man named Eli retorted. "Our plan didn't include scaring him to death. It just included getting him away clean." Plan? The word hit Henry harder than the wind. Getting him away? This was a plan? This terror? This nightmare? It was all part of a plan. With a grunt of frustration, Thornfield took a step back from the edge. Henry's feet hit solid ground, and the relief was so intense his legs gave out, and he collapsed into a heap, gasping for air. He was alive. He was alive. But his mind was a whirlwind of confusion. "You took too long," Thornfield growled at Eli. "I had to make it look convincing. What if someone followed us?" "No one followed," Eli said, lowering his rifle slightly. "The town's scared spitless of you, just like you wanted. But this was too much. Look at him." Henry looked up at them, two giants arguing over his fate. Thornfield, the terrifying monster, and Eli, the what? His savior? His other captor? Tell me about your father, Thornfield said suddenly, his voice sharp, turning his attention back to Henry. The question was so bizarre, so out of place, that Henry could only stare. What? Your father, Johann Morrison, Thornfield barked. Was he a coward? Did he run when things got tough? The question was an insult. A fire ignited in Henry's chest, burning away some of the fear. No, he shouted, his voice cracking. My papa never ran from anything. He was the bravest man I knew. He said, a man takes care of his family no matter what. And your mother? Thornfield pressed, his gray eyes boring into him. What did she teach you? She said, Henry's voice hitched, the memory fresh and painful. She said being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But letting fear stop you from doing what's right, that's what makes you a coward. Thornfield and Eli exchanged a look. It was a look Henry couldn't decipher, but it felt heavy, significant. Wise woman, Thornfield muttered. He knelt down, bringing his face level with Henry's. His eyes, which had looked so empty before, now seemed complicated. There was something other than cruelty in them, something that looked like pain. Your parents, Henry, Thornfield said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. They didn't die from pneumonia. The world stopped spinning. It just stopped. Henry stared at him, unable to breathe. What are you talking about? He whispered. Everyone said, the cold. The cold didn't help, Thornfield said grimly. But it wasn't what killed them. Pneumonia doesn't leave knife wounds, boy. Small ones. Hidden. Your parents were murdered. The words were stones dropping into a deep, silent well. Murdered. The word was alien. Impossible. His ma and pa, gentle, hard-working people. Who would murder them? Why? They were killed by claim jumpers, Thornfield continued, his voice low and intense. Men who wanted your land. The same men who paid folks in the settlement to keep quiet about it. The same men who would have come for you next if we hadn't gotten you out. Henry's head was swimming. The monster who was going to kill him was now saying he'd saved him, and there was a second man, and his parents were murdered? It was too much. None of it made sense. So you took me to protect me, Henry stammered, looking from Thornfield to Eli. Thornfield's granite face seemed to crack, just a little. A deep, weary sadness filled his eyes. I took you because you're my grandson, Henry. The confession hung in the cold mountain air, more shocking than any threat, more terrifying than any cliff edge. Grandson, this man, this cruel, terrifying monster. He was his mother's father? The grandfather she had spoken of only in whispers? The man who had disowned her for marrying a poor farmer? It couldn't be true. It was another lie, another trick. But then Thornfield reached into his coat and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. He pressed the clasp, and it sprang open. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a familiar smile. It was his mother. The sight of her face, so loved, so missed, broke something inside Henry. He let out a sob, a raw, ragged sound of grief and confusion, and a fear so deep it had no name. The monster was his family. The nightmare was a rescue. And the truth was just beginning. The world tilted on its axis. Caleb Thornfield, the monster, was his grandfather. The man named Eli, who had stood by and watched him nearly get thrown from a cliff, was apparently an ally. And his parents, who he thought were taken by a cruel winter, were victims of something far crueler. Murder. Henry just knelt on the cold ground, the silver locket clutched in his hand, staring at his mother's smiling face. It felt like a betrayal to see her image in the hand of the man who had just terrified him beyond all measure. Why? Henry whispered, his voice hoarse. If you're my grandfather, why would you do that? Why would you scare me like that? Caleb's face was a mask of old regrets. Because I needed to know, he said, his voice rough with emotion he clearly wasn't used to showing. I needed to know if you had your mother's courage, your father's steel, the men we're up against. They're led by a man named Silas Blackwood. He doesn't just take what he wants. He enjoys breaking people first. He can smell weakness like a wolf smells blood. If you were going to survive, I had to know you wouldn't break. I had to push you to the edge to see if you'd fall. Break him? You nearly shattered him, Caleb, Eli said, stepping closer. He looked at Henry with something like pity in his eyes. My name is Eli. I rode with your father for a time. He was a good man, kid. One of the best. When I heard what Blackwood's crew did, and that they were coming for you, I sought out your grandfather. Henry looked at the two of them, his mind reeling. A grandfather who tested him with terror. A friend of his father who was part of the plan. It was a twisted, broken kind of safety, but it was all he had. So, my parents, Henry struggled to say the words. Silas Blackwood? He killed them for our land? Caleb's eyes darkened. It's more than that, boy. It's always been more than that with Blackwood. He stood up and paced the edge of the cliff, a caged animal. Silas Blackwood and I, we go way back. We were partners once, a lifetime ago. We built a freight business from the ground up, but his greed was a sickness. He cheated me, took everything, and left me with nothing. I rebuilt my life, but I never forgot. The hate, it settled in my bones. He stopped and looked at Henry, and the boy saw a flash of the shame that had poisoned his grandfather's life. When your mother, Greta, when she told me she was marrying Johann Morrison, I saw red. Because your father, a good and honest man, had unknowingly bought his land claim from a company that Blackwood secretly controlled. To me, it felt like Blackwood was reaching into my life again, taking my daughter, my pride, my foolish, stubborn pride. I couldn't see past it. I told her she was choosing him over me. I disowned her. The confession hung in the air, heavy and sad. This was the reason, the source of all the pain. Not just greed for land, but an old, bitter feud. Henry's parents had been caught in the middle. When Blackwood found out your mother was my daughter, Caleb continued, his voice barely a whisper, it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about hurting me. He killed them to send me a message, that he could still take whatever he wanted from me, and that he was coming for the last piece of my daughter he hadn't destroyed. You. The whole ugly story clicked into place. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was an act of personal vengeance. Henry wasn't just an orphan. He was a target. The final move in a decades-long chess game between two ruthless old men. The men in the settlement, Henry said, remembering their fearful eyes. Paid off or scared into silence, Eli confirmed. Blackwood owns that town from the sheriff on down. We couldn't risk asking for help. We had to get you out, and it had to look like a kidnapping by some random drifter. It was the only way Blackwood wouldn't suspect you were with someone who could protect you. Someone he knew. It was a desperate, brutal plan, but as Henry looked at the jagged mountains around them, he understood. In this world, kindness was a weakness. A direct approach would have gotten them all killed. They had to become monsters to fight a bigger monster. Caleb walked over to his saddlebags and pulled out a thick wool blanket and a parcel of food. Bread, dried meat, cheese. He sat down on the ground, not too close to Henry, but not far either. He laid the blanket over the boy's trembling shoulders. It was a clumsy gesture, but it was the first bit of kindness he'd shown. Eat, he said gruffly. We move at dawn. Blackwood's men will realize you're gone soon enough. They'll be looking for a lone man with a boy, but they won't be looking for us. Henry looked at him, confused. Us? Eli smirked, a faint, tired smile. Caleb has a place, hidden deep in the mountains, a place no one knows about. We're going to disappear for a while. Let the trail go cold. And then what? Henry asked, his voice small but firm. He took the bread his grandfather offered, his stomach growling with a hunger that had been forgotten in his terror. We just hide forever? Caleb Thornfield looked at his grandson. He saw the tear-streaked face, the small scraped hands, but he also saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire he'd seen in his daughter, the same steel he'd grudgingly respected in his son-in-law. No, boy, Caleb said, a dark promise in his voice. We don't hide. We wait. We train. We plan. And then we go hunting. We're going to take everything from Silas Blackwood, his land, his money, his power. We're going to dismantle his entire world, and you are going to help me do it." Henry looked from his grandfather's hard face to Eli's grim one. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a declaration of war. He was no longer just an orphan. He was a weapon. And his education, his real education in the cruel ways of the world, was just about to begin. As he chewed the dry bread, he made a silent vow. He would learn, he would get strong, and he would not rest until he had justice for his ma and pa. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his belly, but now it had a companion. Rage. The mountains became their world, a brutal, beautiful, and unforgiving teacher. Caleb's hidden cabin was little more than a stone and timber box tucked into a high, secret valley, accessible only by a trail that was more of a goat path. It was a place off the map, a place to be forgotten. But it wasn't a place of rest. It was a training ground. The 3 years that followed were not years of healing. They were years of forging. Caleb was relentless. He woke Henry before the sun, forcing him to run the freezing mountain trails until his lungs burned and his legs screamed. He taught him to track, not just the deer and elk for their food, but the subtle signs of men. A broken twig, a scuffed rock, the faint smell of tobacco on the wind. "Blackwood's men are lazy," Caleb would grunt. "They think the world belongs to them. That makes them careless. Never be careless." Eli, quieter and more patient, taught him to shoot, first with a bow, learning the silence and discipline of the hunt, then with a rifle. "Your pa was a farmer, not a fighter," Eli told him one afternoon, cleaning the long rifle. "But he knew how to use one of these. He said a man's hands should know how to build and how to protect what he's built. Your grandfather is teaching you to protect. Don't ever forget what it is you're fighting for." Henry learned to read the weather in the clouds, to find food where it seemed there was none, to move through the forest without a sound. He learned to endure pain without complaint, hunger without despair, and solitude without madness. The boy who had cried on the cliff edge was buried, layer by layer, under a new skin of callus and muscle. He grew taller, leaner. His eyes, once wide with fear, became sharp and focused. But the hardest lessons weren't about survival. They were about thinking like his enemy. "Silas Blackwood is a snake," Caleb told him one night by the fire, the flames dancing in his cold eyes. "He doesn't strike head on. He coils, he waits, he poisons from the shadows. He uses people's greed, their fear, their desperation. To beat him, you can't just be a wolf. You have to be a fox." They studied maps of the territory that Caleb had drawn from memory. He detailed every one of Blackwood's assets, the ranches he'd stolen, the mines he controlled, the politicians and lawmen on his payroll. It was a web of corruption that covered the entire region. "He has a ledger," Caleb said, pointing a thick finger at a spot on the map marked with an X. "Not at his main ranch. Too obvious. He keeps it at a fortified way station he uses for his smuggling operations. Every bribe, every murder, every crooked deal, it's all in there. It's the one thing that can bring him down." "So we steal it?" Henry asked. He was 11 now, and his voice had a new, steady tone. "It's not that simple," Eli interjected. "The place is a fortress, manned day and night. No one gets in or out without Blackwood's say-so. For 3 years they lived like ghosts, their entire existence focused on this one goal. They would get that ledger. They would expose Blackwood. They would have their justice." Henry's grief for his parents hardened into a cold, driving purpose. He wasn't just his mother's son or his grandfather's heir. He was their avenger. Then one day, Eli didn't come back from a scouting trip to the lowlands. They waited 1 day, then 2. On the 3rd day, Caleb's face was grim. "He's been taken, or he's dead." A cold dread washed over Henry. Eli had been his balance, the quiet voice of reason against Caleb's harshness. Without him, there was only the cold fire of his grandfather's vengeance. "We stick to the plan," Caleb said, his voice flat. Eli knew the risks. Wallowing in it won't bring him back. It's time. Blackwood will be getting comfortable. He'll think Eli was just a stray drifter who got lost in a blizzard. He won't be expecting us. He won't be expecting you. Caleb looked at Henry, his gaze intense. You're ready, but are you smart enough? Are you cold enough to do what needs to be done? That night a rider came, not to their hidden cabin, no one could find it, but to an old, prearranged dead drop in a hollow log miles down the mountain. It was a message, scrawled on a piece of buckskin. Henry and Caleb found it under the full moon. It wasn't from one of their few trusted contacts. The handwriting was crude, the message simple and chilling. I have your friend. I know about the boy. Come to the Sweetwater Bridge. Midnight, 3 days. Come alone, old man, or I'll send him back to you one piece at a time. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. It was Blackwood. It's a trap, Henry said immediately. Of course it's a trap, Caleb snarled, crushing the buckskin in his fist. He'll have a dozen men there. He wants me. If he gets me, you're next. A desperate plan began to form in Henry's mind. A plan born of 3 years of relentless training. A fox's plan. No, Henry said, and Caleb turned to look at him, surprised by the authority in his voice. He's expecting you. The old man. The wolf. He's not expecting me. He thinks I'm just a boy. A piece on the board. He's forgotten about me. Caleb stared at his grandson. The boy he had terrified on a cliff was gone. In his place stood a young man with the eyes of a hunter. What are you saying? Caleb asked, though he already knew. You're the bait, Henry said, his voice as cold as the mountain air. You'll go to the bridge, just like he wants. You'll draw their eyes, and while every rifle is pointed at you, I'll be going for the ledger. It was insane, a suicide mission, to sneak into Blackwood's fortress while the man himself was away, springing a trap for his archenemy. But it was also brilliant. It was the one thing Blackwood would never see coming. The snake would be so focused on the wolf, he wouldn't notice the viper sliding into his nest. Caleb studied Henry's face for a long, silent moment. He saw the determination there, the cold logic. He saw the boy he'd almost broken transformed into the weapon he'd always wanted. And he saw something else too, a terrifying, heartbreaking reflection of himself. If you're not back by dawn, Caleb began. Don't wait for me, Henry finished, his gaze unwavering. Finish it. The pact was sealed, not with a handshake but with a shared look of grim understanding. The final, desperate gambit was on the board, and the boy who had once begged for his life was now walking willingly into the heart of the monster's lair, ready to trade his own life for a chance at justice. The night of the exchange was cold and moonless, a perfect shroud for secrets and violence. Henry, now a shadow in the darkness, moved through the woods bordering Blackwood's way station. Every sense was on fire. The snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the scent of wood smoke, each was a piece of a deadly puzzle. He was alone, his grandfather miles away, riding toward a bridge and a dozen waiting rifles. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it focused him. This was the culmination of everything. 3 years of pain, practice, and patience, all leading to this single night. The way station was just as Caleb had described it, a rough-hewn fortress of logs and stone, surrounded by a high fence. A single, heavily guarded gate was the only way in. Or so they thought. Henry didn't go to the gate. He went to the back where a small stream, choked with brush, ran under the fence. It was a detail Eli had noted on a scouting trip months ago, a potential weakness they had discussed and dismissed as too risky. Tonight, risk was all he had. He slipped into the icy water, the cold a brutal shock that he forced himself to ignore. He moved slowly, using the thick overhanging branches as cover until he reached the fence. The gap beneath it was small, barely big enough for a boy, but too small for a man. Blackwood's arrogance had created the very door Henry needed. He slid under, the rough logs scraping his back, and emerged inside the compound, dripping and silent. He was in the belly of the beast. He could hear the rough laughter of men from the main bunkhouse. Most of the guards were there, drinking and playing cards, confident that their master was miles away, about to crush his old enemy. Only 2 guards patrolled the perimeter. Henry waited, his breathing slow and steady, memorizing their patterns. He moved only when their backs were turned, melting from one shadow to the next, a ghost in their midst. The office where Caleb said the ledger was kept was a small, separate building. A single lamp burned in the window. A lone guard sat inside, his chair tilted back, boots up on the desk. Henry crept to the window, peering through a grimy pane of glass. He saw a heavy iron safe in the corner. The ledger had to be inside, but the guard was a problem. Henry remembered one of Caleb's brutal lessons. Never fight fair. A fair fight is a fight you haven't planned properly. Use their expectations against them. He picked up a small rock and circled around to the far side of the building. He took a deep breath and threw the rock hard against the bunkhouse wall. It made a sharp crack in the night silence. Inside the bunkhouse, the laughter stopped. A door creaked open. "Who's out there?" a man shouted. The guard in the office jolted awake. He grabbed his rifle and went to the door, peering out into the darkness, trying to see what the commotion was about. That was the moment Henry needed. He slipped through the now open door behind the guard, silent as smoke, and flattened himself in the dark corner behind a stack of crates. The guard grumbled, saw nothing, and came back inside, leaving the door ajar. He sat back down, shaking his head at the imagined noise. He didn't even know death had just slipped into the room with him. Henry waited for his heart to stop pounding. Then he moved. He knew the combination to the safe. Or rather, he knew the man. Caleb had spent hours drilling him on Blackwood's psychology. "He's a narcissist," Caleb had said, proud of his origins. "The numbers will mean something to him. The year he came west, the day he betrayed me. Something personal." Henry knelt before the heavy iron box, his fingers, numb with cold, touching the dial. He tried the first combination Caleb had suggested, the date of their partnership's founding. 1868. He turned the dial. Click, click, click. He pulled the handle. Nothing. He tried the second, the date Caleb had been forced out. 4271. Click, click, click. He pulled. The heavy door remained shut. A knot of panic tightened in his stomach. He could hear the guards outside settling back down. Time was running out. His grandfather was riding into a trap. Eli was a hostage. He had to get this right. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to think. What was Caleb missing? What was the one thing Blackwood valued above all else? It wasn't partnership. It wasn't betrayal. It was himself. His own name. Blackwood. How would a man like that translate his own name into numbers? Henry thought about the simple codes children used. A1, B2, C3, BLACKWOOD. He did the math in his head. B2, L or Mars 12, A1, C3, K or 11. He tried the first two numbers. 2, 12. He spun the dial. He tried the next two. 1, 3. His fingers were shaking now. He finished the sequence. He held his breath and pulled the handle. With a heavy, deep thunk, the lock disengaged. The safe door swung open, and there it was, a thick, leather-bound book. He grabbed it, his heart soaring. He had it. He had done it. He tucked the book inside his coat and turned to leave, and froze. The guard was no longer sitting at the desk. He was standing by the open door, a silhouette against the dim light of the compound, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He hadn't seen Henry yet. He was looking out, distracted by the earlier noise. But he was blocking the only way out. Henry's mind raced. He could try to rush him, but the man was large, and a shotgun blast would bring the whole compound down on him. He was trapped. He had the prize, but he was caged in with it. Then he saw it. On the desk, next to the lantern, was a heavy glass inkwell. It was full. Another of Caleb's lessons echoed in his mind. The best weapon is the one they never see coming. He had one chance. One single, desperate, impossible chance. He backed away from the door, deeper into the shadows of the office. He took a deep, silent breath and prepared to do the one thing the guard would never, ever expect. The guard stood in the doorway, a hulking shape blocking Henry's escape. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs. He was so close. To fail now, to be caught here, was unthinkable. He clutched the heavy ledger under his coat, its weight both a triumph and a burden. He took another look at the glass inkwell on the desk. It was his only chance. He couldn't fight the man, but maybe he didn't have to. With a silent prayer, Henry lunged, not for the door, but for the desk. He grabbed the lantern, its metal hot against his palm, and hurled it with all his strength at the far corner of the room, into a pile of old newspapers and wanted posters. The glass chimneys shattered, and oil-fed flames erupted with a hungry whoosh. Fire. The universal signal for panic. The guard spun around, his eyes wide with shock as the corner of his office exploded in light and heat. "Fire! Get water!" he yelled, his attention completely diverted. That was Henry's moment. While the guard was distracted by the flames, Henry snatched the heavy inkwell. He didn't throw it. He ran, head down, like a battering ram. He slammed into the back of the guard's knees with all the force his young body could muster. The man's legs buckled with a grunt of surprise. He stumbled forward, off balance. As he fell, Henry swung the inkwell in a vicious arc, striking the man square on the temple. There was a sickening crunch, and the guard collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, hitting the floor and not moving. Henry didn't wait to see if he was breathing. He was out the door and into the night, the shouts of "Fire!" echoing behind him. The compound was descending into chaos. Men were running from the bunkhouse, buckets in hand, their attention fixed on the growing blaze. No one saw the small, dripping figure slip back into the shadows. No one saw him disappear under the fence and back into the freezing stream. He ran. He ran harder than he ever had in his life, fueled by adrenaline and terror, in a fierce, burning triumph. He had the ledger. He had done the impossible. He reached the rendezvous point, a cluster of ancient, lightning-scarred pines. Just as the first hint of gray was touching the eastern sky, he was exhausted, frozen, and bruised, but he was alive, and he was victorious. He waited, scanning the woods, his rifle ready. Had his grandfather survived? Had the trap been sprung? Minutes stretched into an hour. The sky lightened. Despair began to creep in. What if Blackwood hadn't taken the bait? What if he'd sent his men to the bridge while he stayed behind? What if Caleb had ridden into that trap only to find it empty, a diversion from the real attack at the way station? Then he heard it, the slow, tired tread of a single horse. Henry raised his rifle, his heart in his throat. A figure emerged from the morning mist. It was Caleb, slumped in the saddle, his face pale and drawn. His left arm was wrapped in a crude, blood-soaked bandage. But he was alive, and behind his horse, tied by a rope, stumbled another man, a man with a grim face and watchful eyes, bruised and battered, but walking on his own 2 feet. Eli. "Henry!" Eli croaked, a grin splitting his swollen lip. "You crazy little brat. You actually did it." Henry ran to them, the relief so overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. "Are you hurt?" he asked Caleb, looking at the bloody arm. "Flesh wound," Caleb grunted, waving it off, though his face was tight with pain. Blackwood's trap was real enough, but he got greedy. He wanted to be there to see my face. He left his best men with me and took only a few to the bridge. We were outgunned, but Eli here created a diversion, gave me a fighting chance. He looked at Henry, and for the first time, the boy saw something in his grandfather's eyes that looked like pure, unadulterated pride. "Did you get it?" Henry didn't have to answer. He pulled the thick leather ledger from under his coat. He held it up. A slow, grim smile spread across Caleb Thornfield's face. It was a terrifying sight. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed the weapon that would win a war he'd been fighting for 30 years. "He has no idea," Caleb whispered, his voice filled with a chilling glee. "Silas Blackwood thinks he won tonight. He thinks he bloodied me and scattered my only ally. He's riding back to his fortress right now, feeling victorious. He has no idea his entire world is in this book, that his life as he knows it is over." They had the evidence. They had the proof to expose every crime, every bribe, every murder. They could bring down the king. But as Henry looked at the ledger in his hands, a new cold thought entered his mind. The local law was on Blackwood's payroll. The territorial judge was his friend. Who could they possibly take this to? Handing this book to the wrong man would be a death sentence. They had won the battle, but Henry suddenly realized the war was far from over. Getting the ledger wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the most dangerous part of their plan, because now they weren't just fugitives. They were the 2 most wanted men in the territory, carrying a truth so explosive it could get them, and anyone who helped them killed. And Blackwood would soon realize what he'd lost. He wasn't just a snake anymore. He was a wounded snake, and that was when they were at their most venomous. The next few weeks were a blur of nervous tension. They retreated deeper into the mountains, to an even more remote line shack Caleb had stocked years ago for just such an emergency. Eli's wounds healed, as did Caleb's, but the mood was not one of celebration. It was one of coiled suspense. They had a bomb in their hands, and they were looking for a safe place to light the fuse. The ledger was worse than they could have imagined. Page after page in Blackwood's own precise, arrogant handwriting detailed a reign of terror. Bribes to marshals, payoffs to judges, contracts for arson and murder. And on the last page of entries, two lines that made Henry's blood run cold. J. Morrison and G. Morrison, final payment to Henderson for silence. Claim secured. The widow Henderson, the kind old woman who had taken him in. She had been paid. She had known his parents were murdered and had said nothing. The betrayal was a bitter pill, another layer of Blackwood's poison seeping into the world. So we can't trust anyone, Henry said, closing the book. The hope of a simple, clean justice was gone. The world was even uglier than he had thought. Never could, Caleb grunted. The law is a tool, and right now Blackwood owns the men who hold it. We give this to the local marshal, and it'll be burned within the hour, right before they hang us for stealing it. There has to be someone, Eli insisted, pacing the small cabin. A federal marshal? The territorial governor? The governor plays cards with Blackwood twice a month, Caleb scoffed, and the nearest federal marshal is in Cheyenne, 100 miles away, through territory crawling with Blackwood's men. He knows the book is gone. He'll have patrols on every road. We'd never make it. They were trapped. They had the truth, but they were silenced by the very corruption they sought to expose. Days turned into a week. Their supplies dwindled. The weight of their victory felt more and more like a tombstone. The rage that had fueled Henry for years was being replaced by a cold, creeping despair. What was the point of all this, if the guilty man was untouchable? It was Henry who broke the stalemate. He had been staring at the maps for days, his mind working, replaying every lesson Caleb had ever taught him. Use their own system against them. Use their arrogance. We don't go to the law, Henry said quietly. The two men turned to look at him. We make the law come to us, and not Blackwood's law. He pointed to the map. The Union Pacific Railroad runs through Rawlins, 50 miles south of here. In 2 weeks, a payroll train is coming through, carrying wages for the entire territory. It'll have federal guards on it. Not local thugs, but U.S. Army soldiers. They're incorruptible. It's still 50 miles through hell, kid, Eli said. We don't take the book to them, Henry explained, his eyes bright with a dangerous idea. We do something that will force them to come off that train, something that will force the U.S. government to send investigators that Blackwood can't buy. We're going to rob a train. Caleb and Eli stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Not the payroll, Henry continued quickly. Something else, something that belongs to Blackwood. According to this ledger, he's smuggling untaxed gold from his mines on the same train, hidden in barrels of flour. He's cheating the government. We don't steal the payroll. We steal his illegal gold. We don't keep it. We leave it, piled on the tracks, with a note and a single page from this ledger, the page detailing the gold smuggling. We create a crime so public, so brazen, that the federal authorities will have no choice but to launch a full-scale investigation. They'll have to send their own people, and when they arrive, that's when we give them the rest of the book. Silence filled the cabin. It was an act of pure, distilled genius, and it was terrifyingly dangerous. They would be branding themselves as train robbers, the most wanted criminals in the West. But they would be doing it to expose a greater crime. It was a fox's plan, born from a wolf's desperation. Caleb Thornfield looked at his grandson, and for the second time, that slow, grim, terrifying smile spread across his face. The boy's right, he said. Blackwood built an empire of shadows. We're going to drag it kicking and screaming into the light. The plan was set. It was a final, all-or-nothing gamble. They would become outlaws to enforce the law. They would risk their lives and their freedom on the hope that somewhere there was still a justice that couldn't be bought. They left the mountains, moving only at night, 3 ghosts on a mission. They were no longer just hunters. They were about to become legends. As they rode south toward the railroad tracks and their destiny, Henry thought of his ma and pa. He hoped they would understand. He wasn't just seeking revenge anymore. He was seeking a reckoning, and he was willing to burn down the whole crooked world to get it. The final move of the chess game was about to be played. And it wasn't going to be a king or a knight that decided it. It was going to be the pawn they had all forgotten. The train tracks were two silver lines cutting through the vast, dark expanse of the Wyoming night. Henry lay on his belly on a ridge overlooking the rails, the cold ground leaching warmth from his body. Beside him, Caleb and Eli did the same. They had spent 2 days watching, learning the patrols, the schedules, the layout of the land. This was the spot, a sharp curve where the train would have to slow down, with plenty of cover on either side. "You remember the plan?" Caleb whispered, his voice a low rumble. Henry nodded, his heart a steady, slow drum. He wasn't the scared boy from the cliff anymore. He was a creature of purpose. "Eli, you set the charge on the track, just enough to stop her, not to derail her. I get to the freight car with the flour barrels. Grandfather, you and your rifle keep the guards busy. We're in and out in 5 minutes." "It's not the guards on the train I'm worried about," Eli muttered, checking the fuse on the small dynamite charge. "Blackwood's not stupid. He'll have riders of his own shadowing the shipment." As if on cue, they heard it, the distant, mournful whistle of the locomotive, a lonely cry in the wilderness. Then a faint vibration in the ground. She was coming. "Showtime," Caleb said, and cocked his rifle. Eli scurried down the embankment and placed the charge. Henry pulled the bandana up over his face, his eyes the only part of him visible. The train's headlamp cut a bright, searching cone through the darkness, growing larger and larger. The ground began to shake. Boom! The explosion was sharp and loud, echoing off the hills. It wasn't huge, but it was enough. A section of track twisted and buckled. The train's brakes screeched in a horrific chorus of metal on metal, sparks flying as the massive engine ground to a halt just feet from the damaged rail. Immediately, shouts erupted. Doors slid open, and uniformed army guards spilled out, rifles at the ready. Crack! Caleb's rifle fired from the ridge opposite them. The bullet whizzed over the guards' heads, smacking into the side of the train car. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to terrify and confuse. The guards immediately dropped, taking cover, firing blindly into the darkness where the shot had come from. That was Henry's cue. He slid down the embankment like a snake, silent and fast. He ran low, using the train itself as cover, until he reached the freight car marked with a faint chalk symbol they'd identified earlier. He slid the heavy door open and jumped inside. The car was filled with barrels. The air was thick with the smell of flour. He used a crowbar to pry open the first one. Nothing but white powder. The second, the third. Panic began to prick at him. What if the intel was wrong? Then his crowbar hit something hard in the fourth barrel. He dug his hands into the flour and felt it. A heavy canvas sack. He pulled it out. Gold bars. He worked faster, pulling sack after sack from the barrels, piling them by the open door. Suddenly, he heard more gunfire. But this was different. Closer, more frantic. It was coming from behind the train. Eli was right. Blackwood had his own men watching the shipment. A full-blown firefight had erupted between Caleb, the army guards, and Blackwood's hidden riders. They were caught in a three-way crossfire. "Henry, now!" Eli yelled, appearing at the door. "We're out of time!" Together they started heaving the heavy sacks of gold out of the car, piling them on the ground. This was the signal, the proof. Just as they threw the last sack out, a bullet splintered the wood of the door frame right next to Henry's head. One of Blackwood's men was charging their position. Eli shoved Henry back into the car and raised his pistol. He fired twice. The man grunted and fell. "Go! Get back to the horses!" Eli shouted, laying down covering fire. Henry didn't hesitate. He jumped from the car, landing hard. He left the single page from the ledger, weighted down with a rock, on top of the pile of gold. Then he ran, scrambling up the embankment as bullets kicked up dirt all around him. He could hear Caleb's rifle still cracking from the ridge, a steady, deadly rhythm that was keeping the soldiers pinned down. He reached the horses, his lungs burning. He untied the reins, his hands shaking. Where were they? The firefight was a chaotic mess of muzzle flashes and shouting. Then he saw them, two figures breaking from the darkness, running full tilt toward him. Caleb and Eli vaulted onto their horses just as a full posse of Blackwood's men broke over the ridge, firing as they came. "Ride!" Caleb roared. They dug their heels in, and their horses surged into a gallop, plunging into the labyrinth of canyons and gullies that was their escape route. Bullets whizzed past their ears. For a mile they rode hell for leather, the sounds of the chase close behind. They rounded a sharp bend, and Caleb pulled his horse to a skidding halt. "Split up. We'll meet at the fallback point. Go, Henry! Go!" Henry didn't want to leave them, but he knew the plan. He veered left into a narrow, rocky wash, while Caleb and Eli continued straight, drawing the posse after them. He rode for another hour, his horse lathered and gasping, until he was sure he was no longer being followed. He waited at the fallback point, a small hidden spring, all through the next day. They didn't come. As night fell, a cold, sickening dread settled in his gut. He had the ledger. He had started the fire that would hopefully burn Blackwood's empire to the ground. But his family, the only family he had left, was gone. He was alone again, truly alone. He had won, but it felt exactly like losing. He sat by the silent spring, clutching the leather-bound book that had cost him everything. And for the first time in 3 years, he wept. But his tears weren't for the boy who was lost. They were for the man he would have to become to finish this. Blackwood had taken his parents. Now he had taken his grandfather and his friend. Henry wiped his eyes. The grief was there, a cold, hard stone in his chest. But the rage was back too, cold, patient, and absolute. He would not run. He would not hide. He would give the authorities time to arrive, and then he would walk right back into the lion's den. Blackwood wanted a war. Henry would give him one. He would burn it all to the ground. For 2 weeks, Henry became a ghost. He lived off the land, watching, waiting. Word trickled through the territory like a slow-moving poison. The train robbery was the talk of the West. Federal investigators had arrived from Cheyenne, stern-faced men who couldn't be bribed or intimidated. They had the page from the ledger. They had the stolen gold. They were asking questions, and for the first time, people were scared of someone other than Silas Blackwood. But there was other news, too. Darker news. Eli had been killed in the firefight after the robbery. Caleb Thornfield had been captured. He was being held at Blackwood's main ranch, not the local jail. Blackwood was making a point. He was the law here. The trial and the hanging would be his, a public spectacle to reassert his power. Henry knew it was a lie. There would be no trial. Blackwood would torture Caleb, trying to find out where the rest of the ledger was, and then he would kill him quietly. Henry was running out of time. He couldn't go to the federal marshals yet. Not while Caleb was a hostage. He had only one card left to play, the ledger itself, and he was going to deliver it personally. He rode not to the marshals, but toward Blackwood's ranch, the place where his parents' land had once been. He stopped at the edge of the property and saw the changes. The small, hopeful cabin was gone, burned to the ground. In its place stood a sprawling, arrogant ranch house, a monument to Blackwood's greed, a fortress. Henry didn't try to sneak in this time. He rode up the main road in broad daylight, the ledger held plainly in his hand. The guards in the watchtower shouted a warning. Men poured out of the bunkhouse, rifles raised. But Henry just kept coming, his pace slow and steady. He stopped 20 yards from the front porch. His face was grim, his eyes old. "I'm here to see Silas Blackwood," he announced, his voice carrying in the still air. "Tell him Henry Morrison has come home, and I've brought something of his with me." The men were confused, but one of them ran inside. A few moments later, Silas Blackwood himself stepped out onto the porch. He was an older man, dressed in a fine suit that looked out of place in the dusty West. He had a perfectly trimmed white beard and cold, intelligent eyes. He looked down at Henry, a flicker of surprise followed by a smug, cruel smile. "Well, well," Blackwood said, his voice smooth and cultured. "The lost lamb returns to the slaughter. I have to admit, boy, you've caused me more trouble than I expected. You have your grandfather's tenacity." "And my father's spine," Henry shot back. "I'm here to make a trade." He held up the ledger. Blackwood's smile tightened, his eyes fixed on the book. "So that's where it went. You've been a busy boy." "My grandfather for the book." Henry said plainly. You let him ride out of here, and I give this to you. No tricks. Blackwood laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. You're in no position to bargain, boy. I have your grandfather. I have a dozen rifles pointed at your heart. I'll have that book one way or another. Maybe, Henry said, his voice dangerously calm. But do you know what I did before I rode here? I tore out 10 pages. The 10 most damning pages. The ones detailing the murders you ordered, including my parents. I gave that packet to a writer. He's on his way to the federal marshals in Rawlins right now. He has instructions. If I'm not back by sundown, he delivers the pages. You might catch him, you might not. But if you kill me now, you'll never be sure. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. But if you make the trade, I give you the book, and you can burn it. My writer turns back. We all walk away. It was a complete and utter bluff. There was no writer. There were no missing pages. There was only Henry, alone, betting everything on one last desperate lie. Blackwood stared at him, his cold eyes trying to read the boy's face. He saw no fear, no doubt. He saw only the cold, hard certainty of a man with nothing left to lose. The snake was hesitating. The fox's plan was working. Bring the old man out, Blackwood finally snarled to one of his men. A moment later, Caleb was dragged onto the porch. He was a wreck. He'd been beaten, his face a mask of bruises, but his eyes were still defiant. When he saw Henry, his eyes widened in shock and fury. Henry, no, ride! Get out of here! It's all right, grandfather, Henry said, his voice steady. It's almost over. The book first, Blackwood demanded. Let him go first, Henry countered. Let him get to his horse. With a nod from Blackwood, the guards shoved Caleb off the porch. He stumbled but didn't fall. He walked slowly and painfully to a horse tied to the rail. He pulled himself into the saddle. Now toss me the book, boy, Blackwood said. Henry looked at his grandfather, a lifetime of regret and respect passing between them in a single glance. He then looked at Blackwood, the man who had destroyed his family. He held the ledger up, and then he did something no one expected. He opened it and with a powerful rip, tore the book in half. A collective gasp went through the crowd of gunmen. Blackwood's face went from smug to purple with rage. What are you doing? You can't have it, Henry said, his voice ringing with power. This isn't about a deal. This is about justice. He threw one half of the book toward the porch. That's for my father. Then he threw the other half in the opposite direction. And that's for my mother. In the split second of confusion that followed, as Blackwood's men stared at the priceless pages scattering in the dust, Caleb acted. He wasn't a beaten old man. He had been waiting for his moment. He spurred his horse not away, but directly at the porch, letting out a fearsome war cry. At the same time, Henry dug his heels into his own horse, charging forward. It was chaos. Blackwood's men, caught between the two charging riders and their master, screaming at them to get the pages, didn't know where to shoot. Henry rode straight for Blackwood. The old man fumbled for a pistol in his coat, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had underestimated the boy. He had underestimated the bond of family. He never got the gun out. Henry leaned down from his saddle and swept the scattered pages from the porch with his arm, snatching them from the dirt. At the same time, Caleb's horse slammed into the porch railings, the wood splintering. Caleb, his face a mask of pure vengeance, fired a pistol he'd had hidden in his boot, the shot echoing across the ranch yard. Silas Blackwood staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. A dark red stain blossomed on his fine white shirt. He looked down at it, then up at the boy who had outsmarted him. Then he collapsed. The king was dead. The gunmen, their leader fallen, their confidence shattered, hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, the thunder of hoofbeats rolled over the hill. The federal marshals, the real law. They had followed Henry, more closely than he knew. Caleb and Henry didn't wait. They wheeled their horses and rode like the wind, the damning pages clutched in Henry's hand. They didn't stop until they were miles away, hidden in the familiar embrace of the mountains. The Blackwood Empire crumbled. With the ledger pages in hand, the federal marshals arrested every corrupt official, every gunman, every last piece of his rotten enterprise. Justice, real justice, had finally come to Wyoming. Months later, Henry stood on the land that had once belonged to his parents. He held a deed, his name, Henry Morrison Thornfield, written in clear legal ink. The land was his again. Caleb stood beside him, his arm healed, the lines of hate on his face softened by a quiet, weary peace. "They would have been proud of you, boy," Caleb said, his voice thick. "Your mother and your father." "They'd have been proud of you, too," Henry replied. They had both been tested in the fire. They had been pushed to the edge, and they had not broken. They had found in each other not just a weapon for vengeance, but the family they had both lost. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but it was not without hope, it was not without courage, and it was not without love. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us we're doing a good job and helps us bring more stories like this to you. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done with the ledger? Until next time, remember that the deepest darkness can't extinguish the brightest light. Thanks for watching.